Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unwalling Citizenship, a conversation with Dr. Fonna Forman and Dr. Teddy Cruz about their work on citizenship culture at the United States-Mexico border and the network of civic spaces they have co-developed with border communities to cultivate regional and global solidarities. Thank you all for being here today for this final event in our Reimagining Citizenship speaker series. My name is Joanna Moon, and I'm a sophomore in the College of Arts and Sciences, majoring in biology and minoring in migration studies. I'm part of the inaugural cohort of migration scholars, and we're a group of undergraduate students passionate about migrations research and collaborating with the Migrations Initiative. With that being said, thank you to eCornell and Cornell University's Migrations Initiative for hosting this discussion. The initiative studies how all living things migrate from place to place on our planet, and you can engage with more of this work through upcoming activities this semester, such as a film series with Cornell Cinema and a new podcast called Migrations, A World on the Move. More information about all of these programs can be found at migrations.cornell.edu/learn. As we begin today's conversation, I would like to first acknowledge the land on which many of us are on here today. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. This acknowledgement does not exist in the past tense or historical context, with the recognition that colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Now it is my great privilege to introduce Dr. Jessica Levin-Martinez, who will moderate this event along with Professor Patchen Markell, and then introduce our panelists and speakers. Dr. Jessica Levin-Martinez is the Richard J. Schwartz Director of the Herbert F. Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell University, and she holds a PhD in History of Art and Architecture from Harvard University. She is a leading advocate for museum-based interdisciplinary teaching with global collections, and prior to joining Cornell in 2019, Dr. Martinez directed academic and public programs at Harvard Art Museums and the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. And with that, I will pass it on to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. And welcome all to today's program, the last in this terrific Reimagining Citizenship series, organized through Cornell University's Migrations Global Grand Challenge. It features scholars, writers, artists whose work interrogates the limits and, importantly, the possibilities of legal, social, and cultural belonging. And how tremendous today to have Teddy Cruz and Fonna Forman join us to discuss their work on citizenship culture at the U.S. Mexico border and the network of civic spaces they have co-developed with border communities to cultivate regional and global solidarities. And following their talk, my colleague Patchen Markell, together with me, will join our speakers for a kind of far-reaching conversation about their work. Dr. Markell is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Cornell University, where he arrived in 2018 after nearly 2 decades at the University of Chicago. He is a political theorist and historian of political thought. And importantly, we very much want to hear from all of you. So please do ask your question in the chat feature, and we will address those directly to our speakers. And I'm just delighted now for the opportunity to introduce to you our esteemed speakers. Dr. Teddy Cruz is Professor of Public Culture and Urbanism in the Department of Visual Arts at the University of at the University of California, San Diego. I'm so accustomed to saying UCSD. He's known internationally, of course, for his urban research of the Tijuana-San Diego border and advancing border neighborhoods as sites of cultural production from which to rethink urban policy, affordable housing, and public space. Dr. Fonna Forman is Associate Professor of Political Theory and the founding director of the Center on Global Justice, also at UCSD. A theorist of ethics and public culture, her work focuses on human rights, climate justice, border ethics, and equitable urbanization. Dr. Forman is known internationally for her revisionist research, recuperating the ethical, spatial, and public dimensions of modern political thought. And together, they are the principals in Estudio Teddy Cruz and Fonna Forman. Their work has been exhibited widely in cultural venues across the world, including the Museum of Modern Art, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, and M+ in Hong Kong, among other important sites. Dr. Cruz and Dr. Forman represented the United States in the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale. Dr. Cruz, Dr. Forman, thank you for sharing your work with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Joanna and to Jessica for such a beautiful and warm introduction and welcome. And thank you to Eleanor Painter for inviting us to this series, which really conveys our work so precisely, the idea of reimagining citizenship. So Teddy and I are absolutely excited to be here to share our research-based practice embedded at the San Diego-Tijuana border. We really see this zone as a microcosm of all the injustices and indignities experienced by vulnerable people across the globe: political violence, climate disruption, accelerating migration, rising nationalism, border building everywhere, deepening inequality, and the steady decay of public thinking. We live and work a few miles from the child detention centers that will forever stain this period of American history. San Diego-Tijuana has become a lightning rod for American nativism. And although the news cameras are gone, tens of thousands of Central American migrants wait at the wall for asylum that never seems to come, reviled by the Mexican public as a nuisance, an infestation, or else they sit in U.S. detention centers as tools of deterrence, until recently separated forcibly from their children and exposed to a raging pandemic. It has been particularly devastating in recent years to witness the emotional impact on children, their fear, and the inevitable psychic internalization of being socially and morally marginalized. Hopefully, there's relief on the horizon. It still remains to be seen. But the prospect of more border porosity in the coming period is drawing even more people north. With misinformation circulating on social media, conditions are intensifying here every single day. And climate change will inevitably accelerate these flows in the years to come. A recent United Nations survey found that 72% of arriving migrants at our southern border are agricultural workers, and that agricultural instability was a major factor in their decision to walk north. So global injustice is an intensely local experience in this part of the world. Now, against these local atrocities, border communities and activists on both sides of the wall continue to confront and productively circumvent unjust power. Some of this contestation is about sanctuary and protecting people targeted by the state. Some of it is working through the courts or the detention centers and other institutions of power to advocate for people who are ensnared in the net of political violence. Some of it takes the shape of bottom-up civic agency that exposes and counters unjust power, confronts hateful political narratives, and transgresses boundaries. And much of it arises informally through everyday collective practices of resilience and adaptation in conditions of danger and scarcity. Over the years, we have accompanied some of this bottom-up emancipatory transgression and eruption of democratic will in close partnership with agencies at the front lines. In recent years, these struggles have also attracted artists and cultural producers from around the world to engage in gestures of performative protest. But we've sometimes been critical of this uptick in ephemeral cultural actions that sort of dip in and out of the conflict. They can be extractive in their processes, and their impacts on public consciousness as fleeting, as the Instagram posts they generate. What happens the day after, the happening? We've never been interested in our practice in decorating the wall or camouflaging the trauma of political violence with murals. Instead, we advocate for a longer view of resistance, a more systemic approach to the drivers of injustice, and more strategic thinking about cultural, institutional, and spatial transformation in the border region. These commitments have culminated over the years in a project that we'd like to share with you, the UCSD Community Stations, essentially a network of public spaces located in vulnerable neighborhoods across the border region, where universities and communities meet to share knowledges and resources and collaborate on research, dialogue, cultural and educational activities, as well as urban design build projects in the city. The community stations are the field-based arm of our design lab inside the University of California, San Diego. So here we are, our team, our students, and some of our community partners in Tijuana just before COVID-19 hit. We have several core commitments that comprise a kind of community stations model, which we think is highly replicable for universities everywhere. I'll begin today by introducing these commitments. Teddy will then take you on a tour of the 4 UCSD community station sites, and then I will conclude with a few words about our programming at these stations and how they link our local border context with sites of conflict across the world. So to begin, we localize the global. We've always resisted the idea that global justice is something that happens out there in the world somewhere. Living and working where we do, we don't need to send our students far away to learn about territorial conflict, migration, poverty, climate justice. We are minutes away from an international border in crisis, and this enables an amazing proximity between campus and field, between theory and practice, what we like to think of as a critical proximity. Of course, going local here means recognizing ourselves as a region, a site of interdependence. Despite the wall and ugly political rhetoric designed to divide us, we are a binational ecology of flows and circulations, and our future is intertwined. Air, water, waste, health, culture, money, hope, love. These things don't stop at walls. We build trust bridges, long-term partnerships between our university and border communities. We're not like flaky university programs that sort of come and go, diagnosing crises, extracting data, and then disappearing. We don't disappear. We're there for the long haul. Relatedly, we decolonize knowledge. We are keenly attuned to power dynamics when universities arrive in communities and are critical of both extractive research methods and humanitarian problem-solving missions. We don't do applied research, and we don't do charity. We're not a service learning program. Academic culture is filled with vertical assumptions that we know more, that we are trained to solve the world's problems if only they would listen to us. We are committed to horizontal practices of co-production, engaging communities as partners with knowledges and agency. Everybody contributes, everybody learns, and we do things together in the border region that no one could possibly have done alone. Along these lines, universities really too often take for granted the resources that communities invest when they partner with us researchers, right? Time, space, social capital, labor, knowledges. As a matter of epistemic justice and labor equity, these contributions always need to be validated and compensated. We curate two-way flows, inside out and outside in, really unsiloing our campus, inviting activists and community leaders into campus to teach with us, and ultimately thinking outside the box, literally, about what it means for a university to commit to diversity, cultivating skills of cultural literacy, empathy, and awesome respect. These are skills best learned in situ. Today's challenges demand intersectionality, the academic catchword of the moment. But everything that we do on migration, climate change, environment, health, labor, education, urbanization is refracted through the lens of social transformation. We intersect ways of knowing and doing because social change demands it. For us, ultimately, it's about changing hearts and minds, tackling inequality by increasing public knowledge about the roots and springs of injustice, and growing connected, civically engaged border communities capable of collective action advocacy, and productive contestation. Ultimately, we are committed to building a cross-border citizenship culture, a sense of belonging that is defined not by the nation state or the documents in one's pocket, but by the shared interests and aspirations among people who inhabit a violently and artificially disrupted civic space. Those who benefit from narratives of separation and mistrust prefer that we remain a fragmented public here, that the idea of citizenship divides us rather than unites us. We seek to inspire more inclusive imaginaries of coexistence and cross-border citizenship in this contested territory. Our cultural aspirations are inspired by Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal, and a 20th century lineage of civic experimentation and urban pedagogy in Latin America. In contexts of dramatic violence and social fragmentation, cities like Porto Alegre, Brazil, and Bogota and Medellin, Colombia, sought to heal the wounds of history and mobilize a cohesive civic identity through participatory cultural action. The way Antanas Mocus in Bogota, for example, used street mimes, urban games, and theatrical public disruptions to transform urban norms from the bottom up. Or the way Medellin transformed urban remainders and forgotten zones of the city into vibrant civic spaces that prioritized access and education. Like Medellin's now legendary Library Parks project, our community stations represent a model of urban co-development between public universities and community organizations to co-produce the city, right, and fight the creeping gentrification of border neighborhoods. Each station is designed, funded, built, programmed, and maintained collaboratively between the campus and the community. Finally, we reject conventional strategies of urban beautification and innovation that turn our public spaces into sites of leisure and consumption. We question the agendas of the creative class and their pop-ups, which too often accelerate gentrification, appropriate arts and culture for private ends, and ultimately really become an apology for the absence of more substantial public investment in the city. We believe public space must become civicized, to use James Kelly's beautiful concept, a site of dialogue and contestation, and infused with resources and tools to increase public knowledge and community capacity for political and environmental action. So now a tour of the UCSD community stations and just a hint about what happens in these spaces.
For us, urban justice must be a distributed concept, requiring not only the redistribution of resources, but also the redistribution of knowledges. We designed this reciprocal knowledge infrastructure as both a collaborative education platform and a model of shared urban intervention. We claimed that the economic and programmatic power of our public university can be leveraged for communities to develop their own public spaces and social housing. As a distributed system of public spaces transgressing the wall, the community stations spatialize social justice, mobilizing cross-border citizenship through cultural action. With our community partners, we have co-developed 4 community stations, 2 in San Diego, 2 in Tijuana. We'll take you from north to south. The UCSD Earth Lab Community Station is a partnership with Groundwork San Diego, an environmental justice nonprofit located in the low-income, primarily Black and Latinx neighborhood of Encanto, a community characterized by high unemployment, low educational attainment, food insecurity, and cyclical poverty. The station occupies a 4-acre vacant parcel owned by the San Diego Unified School District, who granted the parcel to our partnership to increase educational capacity for the 8 public schools within walking distance of the site. The goal was to promote circulations between traditional classroom-based learning and outdoor experiential learning. This access to municipal land gave us leverage to assemble a unique cross-sector collaboration between a major research university, a local school district, and a grassroots organization to co-develop public space, placing education at the center of community development. Before COVID-19 hit, 3,000 kids and their families circulated through the Earth Lab each year, and during the current transition, it continues to operate as an outdoor, socially distanced classroom. Recently, the school district committed capital monies towards a more refined physical resolution of the site for what has been so far a largely informal effort, while UCSD will invest in sustainable educational programming, research, and management in collaboration with Groundwork, who will steward community participation. Pedagogic zones at the site will be focused on habitat restoration through energy, water, food, community programs, all wrapped by indigenous Kumeyaay knowledges and environmental practices. Ultimately, the UCSD Earthlab Community Station will perform as an open-air climate action park designed for environmental education and climate justice. The district has also committed school bond funding for a new climate action design building to anchor the site and as a pilot for post-COVID porosity in classroom design. This station will break ground in 2022. Moving south, the UCSD Casa Community Station is a partnership with the nonprofit Casa Familiar, a 30-year-old community-based social service organization. It is located in the border neighborhood of San Isidro, site of the busiest land crossing in the Western Hemisphere. The community is 90% Latinx and has one of the highest unemployment rates, lowest median household income, and worst air quality in San Diego County. The heart of this community station is a beloved historic church that sat for decades in disrepair and which we were able to rescue through this project with our partners. During construction, the building had to be lifted for installing the new foundations. During the times of so much political violence inflicted on this border community, the surreal image of the church levitating with Tijuana's informal settlements in the distance inspired a sense of hope for the local residents. With the adaptive reuse of this historic building as catalyst, we designed the UCSD Casa Community Station as a double project, a parcel-sized social infrastructure made of spaces for cultural and economic activity is flanked by social housing. The organizational design of the parcel through a system of linear strips with a variety of small-scale buildings performing different roles was also a deliberate strategy to mobilize diverse financial streams to fund the different building typologies. Leveraging programmatic investments by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to support the educational, cultural, and research programming between the university and the community, Casa Familiar and UCSD secured capital investments by the Park Foundation and Art Place America to build the social service infrastructure. These investments enable Casa Familiar to qualify for a $9 million market tax credit development package facilitated by the local municipality. Casa Familiar has become effectively an alternative developer of affordable housing for its own community of San Isidro, and public space truly was a detonator. We renovated the historic church into a community theater with an outdoor stage. This performance space is flanked on one side by a series of small accessory buildings for Casa Familiar social programming, and on the other side by an open-air civic classroom pavilion. This social, educational, and cultural infrastructure anchors 10 units of affordable housing at both ends of the parcel, all mediated by pedestrian walkways. We never imagined that this choreography of indoor and outdoor spaces would become a community asset during a global pandemic. Ultimately, the project advances in a reproducible prototype for small-scale development in low-income neighborhoods, where buildings collaborate to transform small parcels into housing infrastructures for maximizing social and economic exchanges. We completed construction of this station in February, just before COVID-19 hit, and the residents moved in. It's all locked down now, but it is a site built for social proximity, and we cannot wait to return in person. Affordable housing takes on a different meaning when it is deliberately threaded into spaces for social programming, summoning residents to participate in the development of local economy and cultural productivity, synergizing spaces, programs, resources, and people. This is an integrated socio-spatial system that is programmed between university and community. So let's imagine a small coalition of local artists, promotoras, and neighborhood youth collaborating with university curators, theater script writers, and visual artists who come together periodically to co-produce a play that explores an urgent issue facing the community. Enacted by local youth in the community theater, these artistic productions are rooted in neighborhood stories and become bottom-up evidentiary material to increase public knowledge and policy transformation. Before moving across the border, allow me to pause for a moment to summarize a couple of concepts and share how these processes behind our two San Diego-based stations exemplify several core commitments or building blocks in our practice. In conditions of poverty, housing needs to be embedded in an infrastructure of social, economic, and cultural support. In other words, we must rethink affordable housing from autonomous units into relational social systems. Housing is public infrastructure. Density should not be measured as an abstract number of objects or people per area. Density must be understood instead as the intensity of social and economic exchanges per area. Migrant neighborhoods have taught us that these exchanges, mobilized by bottom-up urbanization, is the DNA for democratizing the city into more inclusive and plural environments. Zoning must stop being punitive, preventing socialization. Instead, it should be conceptualized as a generative tool that anticipates, stimulates, and organizes social and economic activity in neighborhoods. The developer's pro forma is architecture's financial plastic. Inside the mathematics of this spreadsheet, our services as architects amounts to 15% of a project's construction costs. This undercapitalized asset can be mobilized as collateral for development. Nothing should prevent us architects or artists from becoming developers of our own projects, and by association, nothing should prevent communities from doing the same. In other words, the sweat equity of architects, cultural producers and community leaders, the economic equity of public universities, and municipal protocols to accessing public parcels can be bundled, aggregated, to enable communities to develop their own neighborhoods. Truly, this has been our story. Moving across the border, our two community stations in Tijuana are located in the Laureles Canyon, an informal settlement adjacent to the border wall. I will take a few moments to describe this dramatic context. This location is at an important juncture of conflict. Here, the topography of Tijuana's canyons clash with the border wall before spilling northbound into an environmentally protected estuary in San Diego, now layered with security infrastructure. At this hotspot, the conflict between natural and jurisdictional systems and between ecological and political priorities is profound. As we zoom in further, we witness a collision between the estuary in the US, the border wall, and the informality of the Laureles Canyon, home to 92,000 people. This aerial video shows Laureles Canyon and the precarious condition of the informal settlement that has sprawled on the slopes. This site sits 30 minutes from our campus and demonstrates the dramatic proximity of wealth and extreme poverty of our region. Laureles Canyon is impacted by dump sites, drastic erosion, flooding, and landslides. And all of this is exacerbated by the dramatic precipitation fluctuations of climate change. Because Laureles Canyon lacks water and waste management infrastructure to mitigate these impacts, much of the trash, along with tons of sediment, flows upstream, ending in the estuary in San Diego, contaminating this bi-regional and shared binational asset. Here, the border wall is an artifact of environmental insecurity. These impacts have intensified in recent years because of a profound lack of collaboration between San Diego and Tijuana to manage these cross-border flows. In the last decades, 70% of the open lands in Laureles Canyon have been lost to irregular urban growth. We have been identifying and bundling unsquatted lands in the settlement that are still environmentally rescuable to shape an archipelago of conservation. we are advancing an ambitious regional project called the Cross-Border Commons, an environmental conservation initiative that links the estuary in the U.S. with the informal settlement in Mexico, forming a continuous social and ecological envelope that transgresses the wall and protects the environmental systems shared between these two border cities. With our Tijuana-based activist partners, we are curating a coalition of state and municipal agencies, grassroots organizations, and universities on both sides of the wall, and we are now negotiating with the municipality to gain access to the remaining public lands inside the informal settlement. Another important contextual note before I introduce you to the Tijuana stations is that Laureles Canyon has also been the site where we have been advancing our research on informal urbanization. As we have written about over many years, the informal settlements of Tijuana are built with urban waste from San Diego, recycling architectural parts to construct habitation and infrastructure. We have learned a great deal from these incremental building practices as people construct their own shelter in layers over time. In a case study we documented, a metal frame appeared from one day to another. In a couple of months, recycled materials began to thread the spaces. In the next weeks, an informal house emerged. We have also taken note that multinational maquiladoras surrounding these informal settlements typically benefit from easy access to cheap labor. Over the years, we have experimented with factory-made material systems to structurally mediate the recycling of waste. Because Tijuana is a city of multinational factories that prey on cheap labor, we have proposed an ethical loop where factories invest in emergency housing. Here, we are inside Mecalux, a Spanish maquiladora that produces lightweight metal shelving systems for global export, adapting its prefabricated systems into structural scaffold as armatures for informal housing. We designed a catalog with the factory's engineers to test a variety of prototypes and configurations. The first Mecalux typologies shown here with adapted recycled urban waste from San Diego, illustrating how top-down institutional resources can support and must support the bottom-up creative intelligence of informal urbanization. A couple of years ago, we built the first example. Being inside the factory, redirecting its material systems and surplus value to sites of emergency was an important milestone in our research-based practice. We then worked with our community partners to build early applications to demonstrate to the community the adaptability of the system, such as this small bus stop to shelter Laureles workers from the sun. It was important to introduce you briefly to these contextual processes because our two community stations in Tijuana operate within this rich ecology of social, environmental, economic, and material relations and partnerships. Now to the stations themselves. The Ucsd Alacran community station is located in the most rugged, precarious, and polluted sub-basin of the canyon. It is a partnership with Embajadores de Jesus, a religious organization led by activist pastor economist Gustavo Banda and pastor psychologist Zaida Guillen. With limited resources, they began construction of a refugee camp to provide shelter, food, and basic services to hundreds of Haitian and Central American refugees while they navigate unjust asylum processes in the U.S. and Mexico. And with the help of skilled migrants, they began building their own emergency housing. We have established a long-term partnership to co-develop a community station here to increase refugee housing capacity. We are accelerating production of Mecalux frames to install them on vernacular post and beam concrete systems into housing infrastructure. The housing scaffolds will be built first, leaving the interiors as a planned open system equipped with utilities to support incremental live-work configurations. These envelopes are the seeds for an evolving sanctuary neighborhood to be infilled through time by the migrant residents themselves. We see migrant housing as a mechanism for generating jobs. In fact, to sustain the construction processes over time, we are designing what we call a sanctuary economy. We embed refugee housing in spaces of fabrication, training, small-scale economic development. With the support of the Park Foundation, we have assembled a community-owned business, the Little Haiti Construction Cooperative, with a tool library, wood and metal machines, and a couple of trucks and tractors. The community then will complete construction of the site and remain operational for future construction jobs across the canyon. The UCSD Alacran Community Station began construction last summer with seed capital provided by New York-based philanthropists Robert Rubin and Stéphane Samuel, whose collaboration on this project expands their commitment to the prefabricated social housing logics of post-war French architect Jean Prouvé. And finally, our UCSD Divina Community Station. This station is a partnership with Colonos de la Divina Providencia, a Tijuana-based NGO that is rooted in the community of Divina. The nonprofit facilitates a variety of social services, including meals for youth, senior services, medical assistance, and environmental awareness. Using the Mechalux parts, the station takes the shape of a flexible scaffold to accommodate a variety of informal programs, including flea markets, cultural events, and a series of multi-level spaces to accommodate a small high school, all curated between UCSD and our partners. At the Divina Station, we work with community leaders, students, and researchers on social protection from landslides, floods, and estuary health beyond the wall. We lead educational programming through which young people understand zones of vulnerability in their own neighborhoods, emphasizing ecological conservation of species and habitat restoration. It's never too early to begin. In fact, we have committed here to elevating children as the cross-border citizens of the future. Our two Tijuana-based stations have also advanced important building blocks for our practice. Two in particular. For us, the informal or the bottom-up is not just an aesthetic category, but a praxis, a dynamic set of functional urban operations from below that counter and transgress the imposition of top-down political power and exclusionary economic models. Hospitality, yes, is the first gesture when the immigrant arrives, an essential charitable opening, a first step in creating a more welcoming society. But as needs become more complex over time, charity is not the appropriate model for building an inclusive society. We need to move from hospitality to inclusion. Thinking beyond shelter is the foundation for rethinking refugee camps everywhere, from places of short-term habitation and service provision to durable infrastructures for inclusion. Migrant shelters can be agile for negotiating both transition and rootedness, the ephemeral and the permanent.
So these are the 4 UCSD community stations. There's so much more to say about them and our amazing partners and what we do together in these spaces. While the stations all focus on different issues that reflect, the priorities of each community, they're all richly curated for dialogue, collaborative research, urban pedagogy, participatory design build, and cultural production. They all aspire to increase public knowledge, challenge divisive political narratives, foster solidarity and collective agency, and advance strategies to counter exploitation, dispossession, deportation, and environmental calamity. Now, these activities often invite encounters with formal institutions of power that govern the border zone. Sometimes these meetings facilitate mutual recognition and cooperation, and sometimes they don't. For us, the goal is less about resolving conflict than about understanding it, recognizing and democratizing it. We see democracy in the border zone as a fundamentally bottom-up process of exposing and rendering more accessible the complex histories and mechanisms of injustice that are too often hidden within official accounts of who we are in this region. Racist political narratives in the United States portray the border as a site of rupture and criminality. But we are committed to generating very different stories counter narratives about life in this region grounded in the experiences of those who inhabit it. We are a region of flows and circulations, shared practices and aspirations, alliances of hearts and minds, regardless of the physical wall that restricts the movement of our bodies. In this sense, the community stations become a cross-border observatory, a platform for constructing what we think of as elastic civic identity from the bottom up, a kind of cross-border res publica. With our partners, we curate unwalling experiments that dissolve the wall using visual tools like diagrams and radical cartographies to situate border neighborhoods within broader spatial ecologies of circulation and interdependence, from local to regional to continental and ultimately to global scales. We see elasticity as a kind of civic skill, the ability to stretch and return between local and more expansive ways of thinking over and again, really to understand one's challenges within broader dynamics and processes, and to envision opportunities for solidarity and collective action across walls. Here at the border, the idea of a bioregion, the binational watershed system that Teddy introduced earlier, has been a powerful imaginary for activating more elastic civic thinking here in San Diego, Tijuana. Several years ago, we curated a cross-border public action through one of the sewage drains that Homeland Security had carved into the wall between Laureles Canyon and the Tijuana River estuary that Teddy introduced you to. We negotiated a permit with U.S. Homeland Security to transform that drain into an official port of entry going southbound for 24 hours. They agreed. They were disarmed by our self-description as just artists, as long as Mexican immigration officials were waiting on the other side to stamp our passports. Our convoy was comprised of 300 local activists, residents, representatives from the municipalities of San Diego, Tijuana, artists and border activists from around the world. We summoned agencies who are typically at odds with one another in an agonistic moment. As we moved together southbound under the wall, we witnessed slum wastewater flowing northbound toward the estuary beneath our feet. This strange crossing from estuary to slum through a militarized culvert and the stamping of passports on the other side amplified our region's most important interdependencies. The great insight here is that protecting the vulnerable U.S. estuary demands shared investment in the informal Mexican settlement. So in this experiment, we went down, right, under the wall. But sometimes nurturing civic elasticity requires ascending above the familiar. In the early 20th century, Patrick Geddes designed the Camera Obscura in the center of Edinburgh, a 5-story observation tower that enabled people to look out across the region and comprehend the environmental systems that organized it. Geddes coined the term regionalism. For him, it was essential to understand the region to construct a civic identity and collective political will. Now, imagine a Mexican child standing on a narrow sliver of land along the eastern rim of Laureles Canyon, hundreds of feet above the border wall, right here at a place called Mirador. Imagine she plants her feet facing due west, with the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean in front of her, Mexico to her left, the U.S. to her right. Below to her immediate left, she sees the dense informal settlement where she lives. She can spot her house, her school, and experience their proximity to a country that she and her family are not permitted to enter. Below to her immediate right, almost directly beneath her feet, she sees the border wall, which from this vantage looks like a flimsy and ridiculous strip inserted onto a vast and powerful natural system. Lifting her eyes, she sees the green expanse of the Tijuana River estuary with its vulnerable wetland habitats and sediment basins that are contrived to catch the northbound flows of waste from her community. And further beyond still, you can't see it in this photo, downtown San Diego rising vertically into the sky. From this vantage, all the characters of this contested zone come to life. We've witnessed this moment of recognition again and again over the years among children, our students, policymakers, even foundation presidents. There are few places on earth, we argue, where the collision of informality, militarization, environmental vulnerability, and the proximity of wealth and poverty can be so vividly experienced. But in reality, the conflicts we experience here locally between nation and nature are reproduced again and again along the entire trajectory of the continental border between the United States and Mexico. Over the years, we have collected aerial photos like these that document precise moments when the jurisdictional line collides with natural systems, powerfully illustrating what dumb sovereignty looks like when it hits the ground in a complex bioregion. Our Mexus project stretches our elastic civic aspirations to a continental scale. Mexus visualizes the entire border zone without the line. It dissolves the border into a bioregion whose shape is defined by the 8 binational watershed systems bisected by the international border. Mexus also exposes other systems and flows across this bioregional territory. Tribal nations, protected lands, croplands, urban crossings, many more informal ones, 15 million people, and much more. Ultimately, Mexus counters America's wall-building fantasies with more expansive imaginaries of belonging and cooperation beyond the nation state. Here it is in 2018 at the Venice Architecture Biennale. In Community Stations programming, Mexus becomes a provocation for dialogue about a shared bioregional civic identity among Mexicans, Americans, and diverse tribal nations who inhabit this contested space. Now, the final civic stretch, literally, is a visualization project called the Political Equator, which traces an imaginary line from San Diego, Tijuana, across the planet, forming a corridor of global conflict between the 30th and 38th parallels north. Along its trajectory lie some of the world's most contested and violent thresholds. U.S. Mexico border at San Diego, Tijuana, the most trafficked international border checkpoint in the Western Hemisphere, to the Strait of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean, the main route from North Africa into Fortress Europe, the Israeli-Palestinian border that divides the Middle East, emblematized by Israel's 50-year military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, India, Kashmir, a site of intense and enduring territorial conflict between Pakistan and India since British partition, the border between North and South Korea, representing decades of intractable Cold War conflict, and China's accelerating militarization of the South China Sea, along with Taiwan and Hong Kong. Now, visualizing this political equator in red alongside the climatic equator below in green was an astonishing discovery for us, because the ribbon in between them, give or take a few degrees, contains our planet's most populous slums, its sites of greatest natural resource extraction and export, and its zones of greatest political instability, climate vulnerability, and human displacement. And when these parallel equators are applied to the Pierce-Quincunxial projection, from above, the Arctic becomes protagonist, with its melting ice caps detonating hemispheric conflicts through sea level rise, dramatic coastal vulnerability, and human displacement. Ultimately, the collision of nationalism and border building, climate catastrophe, and forced migration is the global injustice trifecta of our time. But as we said at the beginning, these dynamics always hit the ground somewhere and are experienced by people locally in everyday places like ours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Teddy, Fonna, thank you so much for this presentation. It's fantastic, and it's amazing to see a practice that is able to simultaneously be so clearly guided by really important principles of justice and a commitment to things like horizontal co-production and bottom-upness, but that is also able to show us what those things that can sometimes just be invoked as slogans really look like in practice and in detail. It's an incredibly inspirational and important project. I have a lot of questions. I know Jessica has a lot of questions, and we're already seeing a number of questions from the audience too. So I want to start us off by actually, in a way, going back to the very beginning of your presentation, in which Fonna was invoking the current political context, and just invite you to talk a little bit more about that. The first months of the Biden presidency have made it clear, I think, that the disappearance of Trump from the White House is not simply going to transform border politics in a really fundamental way. It's not going to eliminate the pressure to continue to fortify the border or to wall it up, even though that pressure might take less crudely racist forms than it once did. Witness, for example, just to pick one at random, Bret Stephens's recent call in the New York Times to Biden to finish the wall, not, of course, for any reason other than the kind of functional necessities of deterring risky forms of migration and border crossing. So you say, as you say, you're in this for the long haul, which means that you presumably don't expect everything to change overnight. But how do things look on the ground now after a few months? Do you see reasons for optimism, for pessimism, and has the regime change affected your practice in any significant ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. This question of optimism, obviously, getting rid of the narratives coming out of Washington over the last 4.5 years, and that scourge is relieving a little bit of the pressure. But the fallout from these years of racist policy are still very much with us. I mean, tens of thousands of people are still waiting at the wall and in this precarious sort of limbo, and many, many more are en route northbound. So, the situation is intensifying, and the new administration really has a challenge ahead of them. What you said a moment ago, Patchen, about less overtly racist calls to continue policies of border building and discriminatory asylum practices and so forth has been a really big issue for us. In some sense, we've always wanted to keep the wall the ugly steel structure that it is, so that its radical injustice can be targeted. When it becomes sort of decorated or softened or more porous so that there's more movement, sometimes it diffuses the enormity of the injustice of the wall itself. So we worry a little bit about what you just noted, that many of the policies may continue with a different sort of guise or a different kind of veneer. And so we saw that for decades before the Trump administration came in. I mean, so we may be returning to that more, that less overtly, racist mode of containment and discrimination. But remains to be seen. One thing that we've committed ourselves to over the years is to work with communities who are in the front line of these injustices. And to try to amplify their resilient bottom-up capacities, so that regardless of what's happening in Washington, what's happening here locally is always a different story. We've really tried to localize our sense of commitment to the border wall, rather than rely too much on what's coming down from above, far away, but to make ourselves resilient and a sanctuary from below.
Can I add a thought to this just for a moment? Because just yesterday we had a call with our partners in Tijuana at the refugee camp, and they were really narrating the drama of really the last days. I mean, because we have been working in a place that has up to 350 refugees and migrants from Central America, parts of Mexico, Haiti. But in the last weeks, he said the presence of migrant and refugees has increased to 800. So there are a lot of people being deported at this very moment. So yes, the crisis and the tensions continue even with this new administration. But if anything, he was mentioning the kind of narrative begins to also change. At least we were discussing that. I mean, there is something about, there are no more forced separations to begin with, but if anything, there is a sentiment that maybe in the next years, there is going to be a period of more reciprocity. I mean, the changing of the narrative already is palpable. In this sense, the idea, again, of building new links and new strategies of solidarity forever, even within the most tragic last 4 years, really, this region has always recognized itself in a way as understanding that the destiny of these two border cities is intertwined. And therefore, I think that we have always, in fact, Fonna and I were thinking the other days with our partners, ironically, Trump brought us even deeper together transgressing these issues. But what I want to say is this has implications in the physical shared infrastructure between these two cities. So I think that as we are witnessing at this very moment an unprecedented shift in redefining the political economy of the future, or let's hope, of many of our cities in the United States. This also has implications at the border region where there are already some level of messaging that Tijuana and San Diego might begin to collaborate in environmental, even physical infrastructure based on this new paradigm, let's say, that we are beginning to open up. And so, yes, we remain extremely optimistic about this next period.
I found your talk just incredibly energizing. You're not only imagining new futures, you're building new futures. And I'd love to hear you kind of muse or think through how your work relates to cultural diplomacy and the future of that, right? Like, I was so surprised to hear your story of getting the permit to, imagine and build the drain as a port of entry, and that, it's okay, they're just artists. But knowing that you were at Venice Biennale, of course, that the State Department would have been involved in that, or the National Endowment for the Arts, for that matter. So just thinking from your own experience and for others.
That's a great question. There are actually a couple of stories written in the U.S. by sort of right-wing groups concerned that the U.S. government was supporting an unwalling experiment in the U.S. Pavilion.
We got emails, yeah.
So yes, people took note. But arts and culture and changing hearts and minds through alternative channels. As a trained social scientist, I've learned how much more compelling cultural sort of representation can be than facts and data. So that was actually a transformation in my own thinking. But Teddy and I, have always been culturally forward in all of our work, and we often use the forum of the dialogue or the sort of agonistic moment to bring agencies and actors in the region together who don't typically talk with one another. And we really believe that visualizing the conflict in new ways through presence is really important. So the political equator is one example of this, but we often bring political leaders and other leaders of institutions of power to the sites to actually witness firsthand. And there's let me give you one example of this. At the neighborhood of San Ysidro, right at the border, right, there's terrible air quality. I mean, because all of the cars, tens of thousands of cars are idling every day, spewing, into the air. And it's not surprising that lung disease is very high in San Ysidro, which in the minds of residents is often naturalized as the way of the world. But no, it's actually an environmental injustice. So some of our students a few years ago were invited to the backyard of a resident in San Ysidro and looked at his lemon tree. And his lemons were coated with black silt, which became they became sort of biosensors of air quality. But the students also used these lemons in a very sort of performative art project where they used the lemons to, visualize the pollution. And this became then a tool for community performance and to speak to institutions that govern air quality at the border about the challenges that these communities face. So we're always thinking about how we can connect cultural representation with policy transformation. And we see ourselves and our practice as sort of mediating that interface between the cultural expression of these communities and the policymakers who need to hear.
Yes.
Lemons.
Yeah.
Sorry, Pachi.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Teddy.
No, I was just going to say this has been an aspect of our practice that we've been very interested in opening up questions of how artists and cultural producers can be political representatives of the invisible while protecting and producing guarantees. And so when we have been investigating the impact, the positive impact of immigrants in transforming the American city or the neighborhood, that has required a set of strategies to translate and politically represent what ultimately we find as this bottom-up creative intelligence of adapting spaces, plugging an informal economy into a garage, building an extra granny flat, which is non-conforming in the back of a house where zoning does not allow it. This constant, this interesting negotiations with boundaries, spaces, resources that we discussed can need to be brought up to the institutions, let's say policy institutions, to transform land use and zoning policy. So that the way you mentioned it, Jessica, actually we haven't used this word, but it's actually wonderful. It's an act of cultural diplomacy, because it's about negotiating with a cross-sectorial kind of landscape that has been forever fragmented. So more and more, I think artists need to be mediators between the top down and the bottom up, intervening in that interface. I think we're very much interested in that. At that point, art and culture become tools, obviously, that are functional tools to not only rally for new types of community engagement, intervening into public opinion, which has so easily been hijacked by misinformation. But I think at larger scales, it really begins to suggest a kind of a new type of institutional negotiation, let's put it that way, where the political equator, which is an event we do every 2-3 years, that has been the curatorial framework. It will always be in no man's lands along the border, places that are public but cannot be penetrated, and will always require the negotiation with these institutions of power, Homeland Security, municipalities. And that event that we did a few years ago became literally the point of entry, not only into the informal settlement where we ended up working for years, but with negotiations with the municipality of both cities to advance some of these agendas. So truly, it became a Trojan horse in a way to really open up a series of processes.
Could I follow up on that with a question? It's actually about, it's both about the issue of scale, which Teddy just mentioned, and about the practices of visualization that you gave us a taste of in the presentation and that Fonna was also talking about, and about the relationship between the bottom up and the top down. And Teddy, you just said that you think of yourselves as mediators between those two orientations or directions. But it's interesting because those can also come into conflict with each other in important ways. One of the things I thought was really terrific about your visualizations was the appeal to the bioregion and to the ability to see, by paying attention to things like the watersheds, the arbitrariness of the political boundaries that have been artificially created on top of the functioning of natural systems. And, I remember when I was in college, I was in a history class once where on the first day of class, we were given a completely blank map of a continent and a box of crayons. And the professor walked us through filling in rivers and mountain ranges, because these were supposedly the sort of natural facts that then a bunch of arbitrary and changing boundaries had been put on top of. But of course, that, as we know, the natural facts are not purely natural, and also the natural flows are not just like a natural state that we would want everything to return to, because natural flows of things like water are also enormously destructive. And you talk about this in pointing to the impacts of climate change and the kind of mutual relations between the politics of climate change and the politics of migration a little bit in the talk. So sometimes I feel like the moving up to the top-down scale, or going up to the mirador and looking down and seeing the whole region, could attract people to exactly creating bigger, newer, more encompassing regional or global political institutions that would, as it were, be shaped correctly to handle the scale of the global problems of migration and climate change that we're all facing. And that in some ways seems like it's quite, it's maybe complementary, but maybe in tension to the principled commitment to localism and bottom-upness that your practice also enacts. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about frictions between the top-down and the bottom-up that you encounter even as you're trying to mediate them, and how you think about that. And maybe also about the intersections with environmental problems and climate change too.
Yeah, what a beautiful and challenging question, really. Obviously we see tensions between bottom up and top down knowledges and aspirations all the time. I think we've always seen ourselves as resisting the kind of hyper local as well as the hyper global response to challenges on the ground by finding a realistic solution that's connected to territorial performance. So, we've always resisted kind of this very sort of entrenched localism that can't see beyond the scale of the neighborhood or beyond the scale of a region and a city, as well as rejecting this kind of global idea that, we can solve solutions from 30,000 feet up. And what we try to do by bringing the sort of the local and more expansive ways of problem solving together is to be more realistic about actually what the existing real, in a way, which is so often off the table because people either are too myopic or they're too grand. So I see this mediation as a scalar mediation as well as a knowledge mediation in the way that you sort of framed the question. And one thing I want to say in this context as well, as we mediate these scales, we often find ourselves in conflict as with both. So, I think it's particularly interesting from an epistemic perspective when we find ourselves in conflict with the bottom up on these things, because we believe deeply in local self-determination. We believe deeply in sort of the autonomy of communities to decide their futures. But one thing that we've also recognized sometimes is that poverty and injustice can create a sort of a kind of disrupted sense of horizon and possibility. So we actually take this horizontality very seriously. We don't reproduce verticality when we arrive in communities that the community is now suddenly on the top and the researcher or designer is now the empty receptacle waiting to be filled. We actually have agonistic kind of conflict with the bottom up sometimes. And one of the virtues of building trust over time with these communities is that we know that we can resolve these tensions. It's different with, a program or something that just sort of dips in and out. It's very hard to be assertive about, well, actually, we disagree with you here.
Give us an example.
Yeah, a meeting of Teddy, maybe give an example of in San Ysidro, which would be
it's a long example, but the issue is that we have been very dissatisfied with facile and reductive and patronizing advocacy planning efforts, where we go into communities and we just wait as designers, let's say, to understand, what the community wants, and they become the designers, and we just go back to the studio to draw. We are dissatisfied with that notion. We really thrive on the idea that we really enable this sort of meeting of knowledges to demystify each other's cliches for a moment, if I may say, and to really enable a more critical construction of an approach to rethinking urban policy. So, for example, we've done community workshops with our community partners where we have really taken issues that are very problematic, like density. Imagine that in Southern California, right? And we have created physical models and games to really engage the community in a different conversation, because immediately a lot of what advocacy planning does is reducing the whole debate based on just iconography, style, and what style should our buildings be built so that developers can build this sort of project of beautification and gentrification follows. So we wanted to open up more critical debates about it. And the game was an incredible story, because at the end of the game, where people were shuffling buildings and in between spaces and everyday practices and so on, a lady in the workshop said, "My God, I cannot believe these buildings that I've been living all my life are selfish. And she said maybe density can be thought of as in terms of spaces, not buildings. And that was already in a kind of incredible moment of rupture. And from there, we began to enable other types of processes that led to some of the projects that we wanted to do. So yes, it's all based on pushing back and forth gently. And it's not that we are, and that requires a lot of sort of curatorial kind of sensibility and epistemic humility, of course. But yes, what is interesting here is what an artist, social worker from Medellin, when we did our research in the transformation of Medellin, once told us that art, he said, is a cognitive tool that can enable access to the complexity of urbanization. And I think in that sense, I think what you are getting at, Patch, in a way, what has been interested a lot in negotiating these conflicts between top-down and bottom-up is to enable evidence, the co-production of evidence with communities that can be undeniable. The border crossing through that drain was a way to say to the institutions of both cities, the wall is a self-inflicted wound, primarily to the U.S. We are building this to separate ourselves from the other, but we are damaging in perpetuity our own environmental resources. What are we doing, right? And so that was an act of evidence. And finally, even though we're very optimistic in our presentation, maybe that's the reason where we talk about this facilitation being that facile, is not, of course, and forever our work has been grounded on the idea that conflict itself is our creative tool. And so I think that what is maybe not in your field, Patchen, but in my field, a lot of artists and architects still remain ignorant of the many mechanisms, the political economies, the kinds of policies, the institutional havoc that neoliberalization has produced into our own collective resources. And I think getting a specific knowledge of the conditions that have produced the crisis today, for us, is the material of the artists in our time.
So within this broad practice, where is the university? Right. So if we could just kind of tease that out, you talk about community engaged learning, and actually as like learning in situ, helping to develop certain skills of empathy, of cultural literacy, and more. But of course, university is in a position of power, or is it, in the way in which you bring in yourselves, your students, your design lab? Love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been pushing against sort of the understanding of this work as service or humanitarian kind of gestures for a long time. And this has lots of implications for the incentives and disincentives for faculty and, young people to get involved in this kind of work. I mean, many of my colleagues don't even know what to think of what I'm doing. And it's like way off the chart. This is not political science. You can't touch the subject. What are you doing? This looks a lot like social work to people. And so we've been really fighting academic norms that divide our work into research, teaching, and service, and leave this kind of work, service, sort of out of the equation of what qualifies as merit. But that aside, I mean, we've been very fortunate over the years that the campus administration has found value in this work, and we've been, we built toward this. It wasn't immediate, to sort of help the campus understand that this is something other than what, for example, University Extension does, which is a wonderful sort of program within the University of California as a sort of public land grant institution. We have to be improving the lives of the citizens of California, and this is what Extension typically does in the University of California, agriculturally based and so on, to an idea of partnership that we're actually enriching the way we do education and research on the campus through engagement with knowledges that are missing. So if we really think we can make any headway whatsoever on dealing with migration issues, dealing with poverty, dealing with climate justice, we need to figure out ways of getting the voices of those who are experiencing those things on the front lines into our research and our teaching. And this should not be understood as a burden that we're placing on communities, but an opportunity for employment, for participation in policy advocacy that's going to benefit their community. So we're trying to transform the university into a genuine partner to sites of injustice across the region. And we've been very fortunate for the support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, who is the main sort of funder of our work, who understood that to do this kind of work well from the base of the university, we have to invest in human capital that will actually keep one foot on campus and one foot in the community. People who are able to really facilitate the movement of people, money, things, ideas, so that it doesn't become a burden on already stressed community partners. So we feel very fortunate.
In fact, we have received support to fund what we call a public scholar every year from our stations, who are activists who do not have the qualifications to teach in the university, but we become a little bit of the cultural coyotes to bring that knowledge into the university. More essentially, we've been talking about the redistribution of resources and knowledges outward, but I think bringing those knowledges to reorganize our research agendas in the university has been essential, and there is support that we've received to do that. But finally, I just want to say the issue of neutrality, right? The neutrality of research. This is something that we've been fighting also in our own university. In fact, when Fonna founded the Center on Global Justice, she wanted to name it the Center for Global Justice, and she was discouraged that it was too much about advocacy, that it needed to be about neutral kind of objective analysis. And that for us was really emblematic of how our institutions have not really represented these urgencies and engaged them more vehemently and so on. So I think that we want to really, in our students and our colleagues, we want to bring a more sort of a responsibility, let's say, to advocate for us ethically and morally, against what is, the issues that have really perpetuated these conditions. So it's a perennial fight or not struggle inside our university, even for me, Jessica, in the visual arts department, because I have to constantly prove that what we are doing in the community is not just social service. It's an interesting interface and blurs the boundaries between service, research, and teaching.
Yeah, and creates a model for faculty and students at other universities, for sure.
Hopefully, yeah.
I mean, I feel like there are two faces to the question of doing your work in the university. And one of them is what you've been talking about so far, which is the question of how to get that work valued, taken seriously, understood, funded, respected within the university itself. But there's also a question of what the university looks like in an outward-facing way to the people you're engaging with who aren't affiliated with it. Because universities are not only academic institutions, they're also just institutions, and they're either sometimes they're conscripted into being agents of formal institutions of governance because of the way that they depend on federal and state funding, or they are actively institutions of formal governance. For example, if they have police departments, as I assume that the University of California at San Diego does. I mean, Fonna, you and I have a shared experience at the University of Chicago, which at this point polices from, I think, 37th Street all the way down to 64th, and from Cottage Grove out to the lake. And so I'm also wondering, what does it mean to be coming from the university, and what are the relations between the University of California as an institution of governance and things or institutions like ICE or like Homeland Security? How does that all work?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously complex. And in the city of San Diego, the University of California, San Diego is the big, it's a city up on a hill, basically in La Jolla. And I think for decades, the university was very remote and detached from what was going on in the city below. Over the last decades, things have softened up a little bit. And I think that the university has become increasingly interested in being a good neighbor. And increasingly that is being fleshed out. I'm actually very proud of the university in the recent period of intensified ICE activity in our region. The university really became a sanctuary for our students and for our students' families. And I have to say, I was actually very proud to be part of the institution during this last period. And there's still amazing resources for students who are struggling with migration issues and so forth. And they've done just amazing work in the last period on race and indigeneity. I'm just actually very proud of the way the university is performing right now. I have to say, though, that, and I think this is true for all universities, universities are seen as arriving with white flags in communities to plant their flags, and it's often confusing to communities who don't understand the ecology of the university. Sometimes universities come in very flat-footed without respecting the kind of local dynamics in a community. They come with their resources, they come with their power, and then they disappear just as quickly. And so there's a kind of confusion, I think, that universities create when they arrive into communities. And we're trying very hard to change that perception, at least in the communities where we're working. One of the things that's new at our university is, and it's going to launch right after COVID, is there's a brand new light rail that will be coming into the university, public transportation, which can take students from campus all the way down to the border, and people from the border all the way up to campus. And it's going to change, I think, the porosity of the university and the openness of the university to the wider community in the next period.
Even though our work, Patchen, is focused and inspired on the bottom up, we have also been instigating, not only in conversation with our community partners, but our students and beyond, that we also do believe in institutions. And I think that the process of making institutions more accountable, more inclusive, more transparent, and more collaborative is really at stake here. And I think our chancellor, at least, has been incredibly receptive, because at the end of the day, this accountability really equates or results into permanency, into being present, into really partnering in this type of model, because it's about long-term partnership in the long haul. So we have agreements that really entangle the university with the issues and the support systems that are necessary. So I think that restoring trust, let's put it this way, I think that we learned so much for Antanas Mocos in Colombia, that this sort of intersection of two lines, one, increased social coordination horizontally across sectors, primarily in the bottom up, to collaborate and to advance agendas together. But more than anything, restoring trust between institutions and publics. I think that's, curatorially speaking, that's a huge project. I think that's at stake today is the most essential, foundation to move us forward.
So important for me, and I think so many listening, as reflected in the questions, to hear you say, really what's at stake here, And so one of the questions is asking you from a participant, could you talk about the implications of large numbers of children crossing the border and your projects / rationale for your projects?
Yeah, it's intense. I mean, so this is really one of the main issues that the current administration is going to have to face in the next period, and how to find humane, accommodation for these children. Our communities, two of our stations right now, the nonprofits in these neighborhoods are actively working to become shelters and temporary homes for these children who are coming in. During COVID, we've been a little bit sort of remote from these activities, simply because it's been difficult to enter into the field. But as of right now, we're not currently involved with this present wave of children that are coming north. But obviously in Tijuana, our shelter in Tijuana, the refugee shelter, is, the shelter population is expanding dramatically right now. And one thing we've been trying to do is to make the resources, the educational resources of the university available to those communities. So we mobilized, for example, a computer lab to the refugee shelter so that young people could have access to educational resources and so forth.
Teddy? We've been active, actually. Obviously, a project, this is the thing. All of us aspire to be impossibly comprehensive. I mean, how to, and there are limits to what we can do, obviously, and the incredible impact of right now, the flow of children is just unprecedented. But in the last 4 years, primarily, where all these things were happening at the border, really reoriented a lot of our effort to really dedicate much of this work with communities to children inside those communities. And so, for example, in the 4-acre open-air climate action park during this last year, even through COVID, it became the perfect outdoor classroom. And so, but talking to the teachers, we were focusing what before was primarily focused on environmental experiential education in low-income neighborhoods, to really invest in a lot more in creating a pedagogy for socio-emotional well-being. And that's what we're working with our teachers and our curators and so on. And in Tijuana, as Fonna said, we created 2 computer labs, one in the refugee camp and the other one on the other station, to do remote learning a bit, because the impact of children, I mean, the presence of children, we should have shown more photos of it. It's unprecedented. It's amazing in these environments. So if anything, as we said, is elevating children as a cross-border citizens of the future. And that's not just rhetorical. We are dedicating a lot of the investment in really nurturing and advancing those types of sensibilities and responsibilities at a very early age. And our students are learning to be pedagogues, to be curators, and to really facilitate that type of sensibility somehow, right, into new forms of ethnography and cultural production.
I see we're getting close to the end of our time, but I did want to just quickly pose one last question to you that's come to us from the audience. And someone has asked, and I think it's a good question to conclude on, how can an individual help facilitate an inclusive environment for immigrants? And the question adds, aside from financial aspects, yeah. So not just by donating money somewhere. So any suggestions for people who are interested in doing this in a way that's not just dropping a donation into a box?
Yeah, it's really, for us, it's connected to public perception of the moment. I mean, in many ways, COVID-19 was a sort of canary in the coal mine. We always thought in terms of sort of public communication that people would make decisions that are aligned with their interests. Like, this is what we've always been told in the social sciences. And COVID is proving us wrong, that ideology seems much stronger. So you won't wear a mask and you won't get a vaccine, even though, all of the science is pointing to the fact that it's in your interest to do so. And so, what we need to understand, I think, from this is that we need to penetrate into this really resistant public culture around migration. And, I think as individuals, we can all play a role in doing that, in the way we speak, in the way we connect with others, the way we talk to our family, the way we talk to our neighbors. And to begin to chip away at the perception that migrants are a drain on our society rather than a huge benefit to our society. And, because only a certain number of people are going to be moved on ethical grounds, right, to open themselves up to migrants. Only a small percentage of the population. The rest of them are going to be have to be turned through other channels. So I think communication right now is really, really the most important thing we can do.
And obviously the commitment to political activation or participation at the local scale. I mean, I think that as climate is forcing us to reimagine cities as more porous environments, where public space can be acting doubly, not only as a social space, but really as a potentially water management infrastructure and so on. Social emergency, social justice would demand also that those spaces can become a lot more inclusive. I think there is a lot to say about the transformation of housing policy, the rethinking of density, a lot of the issues that we very lightly touched upon, but participating locally in changing policies so that our cities become so much more inclusive. In this case, would be a good step forward, I think, because ultimately the ultimate sanctuary space is our house, our home, welcoming the other. And I think that really is about setting up a very different value system, a different narrative and communication that we all can contribute with. So that's what I would say.
This idea of a different narrative, you're helping to change the narrative on the ground, but with all of us today, can't thank you enough for sharing so much of your energy, expertise, and your vision. And we're excited to follow your projects and hopefully contribute to them in ways that make good sense. Dr. Fonna Forman, Dr. Teddy Cruz, thank you for your time today. I also really want to acknowledge Eleanor Painter. She's the postdoctoral associate at Cornell University's Migration Initiative, and she's just been a creative force for this entire series, and the entire team at eCornell. This conversation feels electric, and I hate to end it. So let's keep talking in another forum. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Jessica, thank you.